In one of Britain's most respected genealogical books, two first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II were recorded as dead. But Nerissa Bowes-Lyon was still alive, and Katherine Bowes-Lyon would live for more than 50 years beyond the date printed beside her name. Nerissa later died in an institution and was buried beneath a simple marker. Then journalists discovered Katherine was still living behind its doors. Who supplied the false dates? What did the family know? And was this a deliberate royal cover-up? Or something quieter and crueler? Decades of neglect? The records tell a disturbing story without needing a curse. To understand why that error mattered, start with how close these women were to the center of the monarchy. Nerissa and Katherine were not distant relations buried somewhere in a sprawling aristocratic family tree. Their father, John Bowes-Lyon, was the brother of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the woman the world would know as the Queen Mother. That made Nerissa and Katherine first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret. The family connection was simple. The contrast in their lives was not. Elizabeth and Margaret grew up inside the most visible household in Britain, surrounded by tutors, officials, photographers, ceremony, and public expectation. Nerissa and Katherine grew up on the same family tree, but moved increasingly beyond public view. By the time Elizabeth became queen, her cousins were living in an institution in Surrey, known to staff and relatives, but almost entirely absent from the public story of the family. That contrast should not become an accusation against two royal cousins who did not make the decisions of 1941. Elizabeth and Margaret were young when Nerissa and Katherine entered long-term care. The choices belonged to adults around them, and the standards of that era were very different from those expected today. Across Britain, people with learning disabilities were routinely separated from ordinary community life and placed in large institutions, often for decades. That wider practice explains part of what happened, but not all of it. Royal families have always been surrounded by ideas about inheritance. Titles pass through bloodlines, and so does the succession. Public fascination with resemblance, temperament, fertility, and health has repeatedly turned family biology into a political subject. When the stories of Nerissa and Katherine became public, it was almost inevitable that journalists would ask whether their disabilities had been treated as a threat to the image of a family whose public legitimacy was tied so closely to heredity. The suspicion grew stronger because Nerissa and Katherine were not the only relatives in the same institution. 3 women from their mother Fenella's extended family were also cared for at Royal Earlswood. 5 related women living under one institutional roof created an image powerful enough to generate a theory almost instantly. Perhaps the family had hidden evidence of some hereditary problem. But resemblance is not diagnosis, and a cluster of related cases does not establish a simple genetic explanation. Publicly available medical information is not sufficient to prove the dramatic idea later attached to the story. There is no responsible basis for calling this a royal curse, and no need for one. The troubling question is visible without any genetic theory at all. How were these women treated once they no longer fitted comfortably into the family's public world? Nerissa was born in 1919. Katherine followed 7 years later. Surviving accounts describe both as women with significant learning disabilities who required lifelong support. Language needs care here because historical records use labels now recognized as dehumanizing. Those words reflected the attitudes of the period. and repeating them as casual descriptions would repeat the insult without adding understanding. Their disabilities did not make them unaware objects in someone else's scandal. Former carers later remembered them as individuals who responded to people, routines, familiar objects, and the world around them. We should be cautious about assigning thoughts or levels of understanding that cannot be documented. But we can say something much simpler. They were human beings whose lives continued year after year, even when official family references began to suggest otherwise. Their father died in 1930. 11 years later, in the middle of the Second World War, Nerissa and Katherine were admitted to Royal Earlswood at Redhill in Surrey. Nerissa was about 22. Katherine was only 15. The date is worth pausing on because 1941 was not an ordinary year. Britain was at war, families were dispersed, and public services were under pressure. Long-stay institutional care was already an accepted response to significant disability, and wartime conditions made conventional family support even harder. Anyone judging the decision to place them at Earlswood has to account for that context. But context is not absolution. A decision that was common can still have produced profound isolation. Once a person entered a long-stay institution in that era, the institution could come to organize nearly every part of life. Meals, sleeping, recreation, medical attention, and social contact were arranged by staff. Days followed routines created for large groups rather than individual families. The system could provide safety and care while also making it remarkably easy for someone to disappear from ordinary community life. That is why the central question cannot be answered simply by saying, families did this then. Many did. What needs explaining is what happened afterward. Nerissa and Katherine did not remain at Earlswood for a few months during a crisis. They stayed for decades. Their mother lived until 1966. Their royal aunt, the future Queen Mother, remained one of the most prominent women in Britain. The Bowes-Lyon family stayed socially visible, yet the two sisters became increasingly invisible outside the institution. Was that invisibility deliberate? One theory suggests that the family wanted to remove an embarrassing difference from sight. It is easy to see where that theory came from. The monarchy presented itself through continuity, order, family ritual, and a carefully managed public image. Learning disability, in the prejudiced language of the mid-20th century, was often treated not as a human condition requiring support, but as something families concealed. There is, however, no public document showing that Buckingham Palace ordered Nerissa and Katherine to be placed at Earlswood, and no released instruction from Queen Elizabeth II, the Queen Mother, or palace officials directing that the sisters be hidden to protect the succession. The decision can look uncomfortable without being transformed into a coordinated royal operation. And the hereditary theory has another weakness. The three other women at Earlswood were connected through Fenella's side of the family. That fact complicates simplistic claims that the condition somehow exposed a dangerous flaw in the royal line. Journalists could speculate about inheritance, but speculation was not medical proof. The sharper mystery arrived later, not in a diagnosis and not in a palace memo. It arrived in a book. Burke's peerage occupied an unusual place in British social life. It was not the government register of births and deaths, and it was not a court. It could not legally declare a person dead. But for generations, it was an influential reference work for titled and aristocratic families, recording marriages, children, inheritances, and deaths. to appear there was to be placed within the formal memory of Britain's hereditary elite. The information depended heavily on what families supplied. That meant Burkes could be authoritative in appearance, while still relying on forms, letters, corrections, and private reporting from households themselves. A mistake in Burkes was not the same as a false death certificate. For Nerissa and Katherine, however, the mistake was extraordinary. The 1963 edition listed Nerissa as having died in 1940. It listed Katherine as having died in 1961. Both entries were wrong. Nerissa was alive inside Royal Earlswood when the book appeared, and she would remain alive for more than 2 decades afterward. Katherine was also alive, and she would survive until 2014. One sister had been placed on paper in a grave before she had even entered Earlswood. The other was listed as dead while continuing to live there. A wrong day can be a typing error, and a wrong year can be a copied note. 2 living sisters recorded as dead by many years is harder to look at without asking how such information entered the record. But that question needs precision. They were not legally declared dead, and there is no evidence that civil registrars falsified death certificates for them. The false entries were in Burke's peerage. That distinction prevents a real scandal of neglect or misinformation from becoming a more dramatic claim the evidence does not support. When the story exploded publicly in 1987, members of the Bowes-Lyon family offered an explanation. Lady Elizabeth Anson said there had been no attempt at a cover-up. The error, she explained, arose because her grandmother Fenella was vague and did not always complete Burke's forms properly or fully. That explanation is possible. Burke's depended on family submissions, and incomplete information could create errors. It also fits with later descriptions of Fenella as someone imprecise with administrative details. There is no public evidence proving that she intentionally sent false death dates in order to erase her daughters. Yet the explanation creates its own uncomfortable question. If an inaccurate form started the mistake, why did nobody correct it? The book remained in circulation. The family continued to exist within the social world Burke's documented, and Nerissa and Katherine continued living in Surrey. A false line could begin through carelessness, but its survival required something else. No one with enough knowledge and enough interest intervened. That may be more disturbing than a single villain. Conspiracy stories are psychologically satisfying because responsibility is concentrated. Someone gives an order, hides a file, makes a calculated decision. But institutions and families can cause enormous harm through a different mechanism. One person assumes another is responsible. A generation avoids an uncomfortable subject. A form goes unchecked. Visits grow rarer. A woman remains alive, yet the social systems around her behave as if she has already disappeared. That possibility became more difficult to ignore when former staff described the sisters' lives at Earlswood. Royal Earlswood was a large institution, and for residents requiring lifelong support, staff became central figures. Care workers knew habits that distant relatives might not know. They observed responses, routines, friendships, frustrations, and small pleasures. This is one reason later testimony from people who worked there became so emotionally powerful. Some former staff remembered the Bowes-Lyon sisters responding to images of the royal family on television. These recollections have often been presented in dramatic form, especially in later documentaries and television adaptations, and they should be handled carefully. A visible response to a royal broadcast does not prove exactly what either sister understood about blood relationships, titles, or the public meaning of monarchy. Still, the image is difficult to forget. Two women connected by blood to the most famous family in Britain could watch that family appear on a screen while living in a world from which royal ceremony was almost entirely absent. The contrast is enough without inventing an inner monologue for either of them. Then came the question of visits. Former staff interviewed decades later said they remembered little or no regular family presence around Nerissa and Katherine. Some reporting described an absence of personal visitors, birthday cards, or gifts over long periods. One former ward sister, Dot Penfold, later described an impression that the women had been forgotten. That testimony is important, but it is not complete surveillance of 40 years. A staff member's memory cannot prove that no relative ever came. Hospital documentation cited in later reporting may be incomplete. Different employees worked different periods, and a visit could occur without becoming part of someone else's recollection. And the family strongly disputed the idea of total abandonment. Lady Elizabeth Anson said relatives had visited Nerissa and Katherine and rejected the suggestion of a cover-up. Other family accounts maintained that their mother Fenella visited until her death in 1966, and that money, gifts, or cards were provided. Those claims cannot simply be discarded because the more dramatic version makes a stronger documentary scene. The two accounts have to remain beside each other. Former carers described little evidence of regular contact. Family representatives said visits did occur. Both may contain parts of the truth. Early visits may have happened and later declined. Gifts may have been sent even when relatives did not appear personally. An institutional record may have missed some contact. Family memory equally may have softened the extent of distance when the story became embarrassing. What cannot be honestly said is that a complete surviving record proves nobody ever visited. The evidence does not support that absolute claim, but uncertainty about visits does not erase the larger pattern. By the 1980s, the sisters had spent roughly 4 decades in institutional care. One widely used genealogical reference had listed them as dead for years, and their story was almost unknown to the public. Even within accounts from the family, information about their condition appears to have moved strangely. Later reports said the Queen Mother learned more about her niece's situation in 1982 after contact connected to the hospital. According to those accounts, she then sent money that was used for birthday and Christmas presents, including sweets or toys. That claim requires careful wording. It does not prove the Queen Mother had never known Nerissa and Katherine existed. They were the daughters of her brother, nor does it prove she had no awareness they needed care. The reported point is narrower. Later, family accounts said she became more fully aware of their circumstances in 1982 and responded financially. If that is accurate, it opens 2 possible questions. If the Queen Mother knew little until 1982, how did 2 nieces so close in family relationship become so distant from her knowledge for approximately 4 decades? If she knew more than later accounts suggested, why does the visible record of sustained involvement appear so thin? Neither question proves a palace cover-up. Both expose a family failure that can exist without one. By then, Nerissa was approaching the end of her life. She died at Royal Earlswood in January 1986, age 66. At that moment, the public had not yet been drawn into the story in the way it soon would be. According to later reports, members of hospital staff were present at her funeral, while no close family members were identified as attending. Because the surviving reporting is not a complete official attendance register, that claim should remain attributed rather than turned into an absolute fact. Even with that caution, the burial became one of the most painful images associated with the sisters. Nerissa's grave was initially marked with a simple plastic marker carrying identifying information. Later photographs made the contrast almost unbearable. She came from a family whose history was carved into stone, recorded in peerages, displayed in castles, and repeated through generations. Yet her own resting place could be mistaken for that of someone with almost no social connection at all. It is tempting to say that the family deliberately ordered an anonymous burial. There is no public evidence of such an instruction. The simpler fact is enough. The original marker was starkly modest, and the woman beneath it was a first cousin of the reigning queen. After the story became public, a more substantial headstone was placed there, restoring a name in stone after a life in which that name had been strangely absent from the family's public memory. But the greater shock came not from the grave, it came from the living sister. In 1987, press reports brought the Bowes-Lyon story into public view. Journalists compared what Burke's peerage said with what actually existed at Royal Earlswood. Nerissa, supposedly dead since 1940 according to the old entry, had in fact died only the previous year. Katherine's entry was even more startling. Burke's had listed her as dead in 1961. Katherine was alive, 60 years old, and still living in institutional care. That single discovery changed the emotional force of the entire case. A false historical entry was no longer only a technical error discovered after someone's death. There was a living woman behind the contradiction. The line in the book had done more than misremember a date. It had helped create a social fiction in which someone continued breathing while a prestigious record treated her as gone. Again, Katherine had not been legally declared dead. The state had not erased her civil identity. She existed in medical and institutional systems, and staff knew her. The error belonged to a genealogical publication, but social existence is not only legal existence. For the world that relied on Burke's to understand aristocratic families, Katherine had effectively vanished from the family narrative. Her name was present, but her life had stopped on paper more than 25 years before journalists found her alive. The revelation naturally produced the darkest possible interpretation. If two first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II had been recorded as dead while living in an institution, perhaps the royal family had deliberately hidden them. Perhaps someone feared that public knowledge of learning disability among close relatives would damage belief in a strong hereditary line, and perhaps Burke's had been used as part of a deliberate effort to make the women disappear. Some facts made that theory emotionally persuasive. The family connection was close. 5 related women had been institutionalized. The Burke's entries were seriously wrong, and public knowledge was minimal. Accounts from former staff described strikingly little family presence, but an emotionally persuasive pattern is not the same as evidence of a coordinated plan. No public document has established that Queen Elizabeth II ordered the sisters' placement, and no released palace record shows Buckingham Palace directing Burke's to publish false death information. Nothing reliable points to a meeting in which royal officials decided that Nerissa and Katherine had to be hidden to protect the monarchy's bloodline. In April 1987, Buckingham Palace responded cautiously. A spokesman said the Queen was aware of reports about the cousins, but characterized the matter as one for the immediate Bowes-Lyon family. The response did not satisfy critics, because calling the case private did nothing to explain the false entries or the years of distance. Lady Elizabeth Anson was more direct. Speaking for the family, she said there had been no attempt at a cover-up. She attributed the Burkes' problem to Fenella's poor handling of the forms and said older relatives had visited the sisters. Those statements deserve space because fairness requires allowing the accused family to answer. They do not automatically settle the historical question. A denial does not erase the documents, just as a suspicious document does not automatically prove the most sinister motive. This is where the case divides into two competing explanations. The first is administrative and historical. Nerissa and Katherine needed extensive lifelong support, and in 1941, placing people with significant learning disabilities in institutions was common. Their mother handled Burke's paperwork badly, and the publication relied on family information and printed erroneous death dates. Family contact existed but was poorly recorded. Later generations inherited a fragmented picture, and no palace conspiracy was necessary. Much about that explanation is plausible. Long-stay institutions were common and social stigma was severe. Families across Britain, not only aristocratic families, removed disabled relatives from public life. Burke's was capable of error because it depended on private submissions. Later statements from the Bowes-Lyons denied concealment, and no palace directive has surfaced. But the second explanation begins with a pattern rather than any one document. Two daughters of the Queen Mother's brother disappear into long-term care, and three more women from the same extended family are placed there. Public genealogy reports both sisters dead while they remain alive. Former carers remember little regular family contact. One sister dies and receives a remarkably simple grave marker, and only after journalists investigate does the public learn that the other sister is still living. People who believe there was deliberate concealment ask whether all of those facts can really be dismissed as separate accidents. They also point to the culture of monarchy. The institution depended heavily on image and continuity, and the Queen Mother had become a symbol of wartime courage and stable family life. The existence of close relatives with significant learning disabilities might have been regarded in a more prejudiced age as something better kept private. That motive is imaginable. It is not proved, and a possible motive cannot substitute for a paper trail. Some relatives may have felt shame. That does not establish a coordinated policy from Buckingham Palace. The family may have preferred silence. That does not prove the false Burke's entries were intentionally supplied. And even if the monarchy benefited from the cousins remaining unknown, benefit does not prove authorship. The truth may be less cinematic and more uncomfortable. Perhaps there was no secret meeting, no single instruction, no moment when someone said, in effect, erase these women. Instead, social prejudice, family embarrassment, institutional routine, distance, and bureaucracy may have combined over decades. Each force alone looks ordinary. Together, they can produce something that resembles deliberate disappearance. One relative fills out a form badly, and another assumes care is being handled. A prestigious book repeats the mistake. Staff change, visits become less frequent, and younger family members know less than older ones. The women remain alive, but fewer people outside the institution ask about them. That process requires no conspiracy, yet the result can feel almost identical to one. This is why the argument over the Queen Mother's knowledge matters so much. Some later accounts said she learned more in 1982 and then sent money for gifts. If so, that suggests information had failed to move even within a very close family network. But it also provides evidence of at least some later concern, complicating the picture of complete and conscious abandonment. The same is true of the visits. Former staff described an absence. Family representatives disputed it. A serious account cannot simply choose the version that makes the family look worst, and it cannot use the family's denial to dismiss what carers remembered. The conflict itself is evidence of how badly documented and emotionally contested these lives became. What happened after 1987 also tells us something. Once Katherine's existence became public, she was no longer merely a line in a forgotten peerage. People sent flowers, and journalists returned to the story. Later documentaries brought new attention to the treatment of people with learning disabilities in the 20th century. The case became less about aristocratic gossip and more about a wider history of institutionalization and social exclusion. That wider frame prevents the royal family from becoming an excuse to ignore the era itself. Britain placed thousands of disabled people in large institutions, and families were often encouraged to detach. The language used by medical and administrative systems could reduce people to classifications. Privacy frequently became invisibility. Nerissa and Katherine suffered within that world, not outside it. Their royal connection made their story newsworthy. Their treatment was tragically less unusual. That is perhaps the most important correction to the cursed bloodline version of events. The scandal is not that disability appeared near a throne. Disability appears in every social class. The scandal is that a society could treat disabled people as people whose absence required so little explanation. Katherine remained in care after the revelations. When Royal Earlswood eventually closed in 1997, she moved to another care setting in Surrey. Her life continued long after the burst of press interest that had made her a symbol. She lived until February 2014. That long survival gives the Burke's era its full scale. According to the 1963 book, Katherine had died in 1961. In reality, she lived for more than half a century after that date. Entire reigns, governments, cultural eras, and generations passed, while the old false entry remained part of the story people repeated about her family. Nerissa's era was equally stark in a different way. Burke's had placed her death in 1940, before she entered Royal Earlswood in 1941. Her real life continued for 46 years beyond the date printed beside her name. Those are not small clerical discrepancies. Records can carry social power even when they are wrong. Yet the evidence still stops short of the claim many headlines want. There is no public proof that Buckingham Palace ordered a cover-up, that Queen Elizabeth II directed the sisters into institutional care, or that the false death dates were intentionally created to protect the succession. There is also no sufficient public medical evidence for a dramatic theory about a damaged royal bloodline. What is confirmed is more concrete. Nerissa and Katherine were daughters of John Bowes-Lyon, nieces of the Queen Mother, and first cousins of Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret. They entered Royal Earlswood in 1941 and Burke's peerage later listed false death years for both. Nerissa died in 1986. Katherine was alive when the story became public in 1987 and lived until 2014. What remains disputed is the quality and frequency of family contact. Former staff described little sign of regular visits, while family representatives said relatives did visit. Later accounts described the Queen Mother becoming more aware of their circumstances in 1982 and sending money for presents. Those claims illuminate the family relationship, but they do not resolve it completely. What remains unproved is intent. Perhaps that is why the story continues to disturb people. It would be easier if there were a single letter marked confidential, a single order, a single person to blame. Instead, the surviving record leaves us looking at something more familiar. Neglect spread across time until nobody can identify the moment it became abandonment. A false entry in Burke's could begin with one badly completed form. But one bad form cannot explain decades of silence by itself. For an error that large to survive, people have to fail to notice, to ask, or to care enough to correct it. That is not necessarily a conspiracy. It may be something more ordinary. And ordinary cruelty can last a very long time. The public reaction after the revelations also exposed another contradiction. Once Katherine was known to be alive, strangers showed a curiosity and sympathy that the official family record had failed to preserve. Flowers and messages arrived. Nerissa's grave attracted attention, and the modest marker that had once seemed almost invisible became a national symbol. Public attention could not give either woman back the decades already spent beyond view, but it forced their names into a conversation that private family systems had never sustained. That reaction should not be romanticized. Media exposure can exploit vulnerable people as easily as it can defend them. Katherine did not suddenly become a public figure capable of choosing how her story was presented. Reporters, filmmakers, royal commentators, and later dramatists interpreted her life for audiences. Some accounts use the sisters mainly to build a sensational story about monarchy, heredity, and secrecy. The women themselves could easily disappear again beneath the scandal supposedly created in their name. This is why the documentary record counts for more than the most theatrical retelling. The central facts do not depend on imagined palace conversations. They do not require Princess Margaret secretly discovering her cousins, nor a confrontation in which the Queen Mother confesses a policy of protecting the bloodline. Those scenes belong to dramatization, not the verified historical record. The real documents are less tidy and in some ways more unsettling. A book was wrong. An institution held the women for decades. Family and staff later disagreed over visits, and the Queen Mother's level of knowledge became the subject of competing accounts. One sister died before the wider public understood who she was. The other was found alive long after an influential reference had told readers otherwise. None of those facts alone proves deliberate concealment. Together, however, they reveal how thoroughly a person can vanish when disability, privacy, family hierarchy, and bureaucracy all point in the same direction. The frightening possibility is not only that somebody might have decided to hide Nerissa and Katherine, it is that nobody needed to make such a decision for the effect to endure. The final act should therefore be to restore what the incorrect record obscured. Nerissa Jane Irene Bowes-Lyon was born on February 18, 1919. She did not die in 1940. She lived until January 22, 1986. Catherine Juliet Bowes-Lyon was born on July 4th, 1926. She did not die in 1961. She lived until February 23, 2014. Those dates matter because the sister story is ultimately not about whether a royal family tree contained imperfection. It is about what happens when a family record becomes more visible than the people it is supposed to describe. Nerissa and Katherine were not erased only when the wrong dates entered Burke's peerage. They were erased each time their lives became easier to overlook than to acknowledge. Do you see this as a deliberate cover-up or something more ordinary and perhaps more cruel? Collective abandonment? Share your view in the comments. If you value careful investigations that separate royal rumor from the surviving record, please like this video and subscribe to The Palace Circle. We follow the evidence closely, especially when the most uncomfortable truth is not conspiracy but silence.